Hey guys, today you're going to learn how to graph sine, and this is kind of an introduction lesson. But before we get started, I wanted to remind you guys about the basic graphing function of sine, the one we've kind of been working with over and over again, the parent function, which is obviously sine of x. And if you remember that the sine of x has a max at 1 and has a minimum at -1. And hopefully you guys remember the basic shape. The basic shape that it starts at the origin, which is here. Then it goes up to the maximum. And then it goes back to the kind of midline, right? Then it goes to the minimum. And then it goes up back to the midline. So if I was to sketch this graph, and you guys have done this a million times, it would look like this shape. Okay, so if you notice, the only points I cared about were the 3 zeros, the ones that, touch the midline, and the max and the min. Okay, so those are the points that we always want to make sure we graph. Now, this one hasn't really changed at all, so if you remember, this is pi over 2, this was pi, oh, that was supposed to be a pi, sorry. This is 3 pi over 2, and then this one is 2 pi, okay? And then, of course, the beginning was 0. So, when you are graphing, there are some things that I always want you to have, okay? So, the first thing that you must always have are 5 points on the midline. Now, usually I would say the x-axis, but as we know, the midline will change depending on your h value, right? The second thing that you need to have is your max and your min labeled on the y-axis. Okay? So the reason being I need these things is that the 5 points here are going to show us our roots or zeros, and will show us our max and our min, okay? So if you guys can make sure that you always have those things labeled on your graph, then you should be okay, okay? Alright, so your other cheat sheet to use when finding stuff is to first look at a basic number line. Alright, so if we had a starting point, we'll write this as start, and we had an end point, how would you find the midpoint between these two points? Alright, hopefully you guys are like, oh, it's the midpoint formula. Okay, so don't write this down because this is just kind of explanation. For the midpoint formula, had you guys adding your x values and then divide by 2, and then you would add your y values and divide by 2, right? Well, we're going to use the same concept, but we don't really need this formula. So to find this middle point, this midpoint here, okay, I call it my middle, you would add the start plus the end, and then we would divide it by 2 to get our middle point, okay? So now, what if I wanted to find the middle point between the start and the middle? Okay, so we'll call that the second point. Well, you do the same thing. You would take the start plus the middle and divide it by 2, and you end up getting your second point. And then likewise, if I wanted to find my midpoint there, all I would do is I would take the middle plus the end and divide it by 2, and I would get my fourth point. Okay, so this start, second point, middle point, fourth point, and end point. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea that you're going to be adding and dividing by 2 a lot in this. Okay, you're going to be doing it over and over and over again. So this is just kind of a broad overview of what you'll see me do. So now let's go back to our main function here. Okay. Let's go ahead and test the theory to see if these things will actually help us find these points. So I want to verify that that concept is going to work, okay? So the 0 is obviously where our graph is starting, right? And the 2 pi is where our graph is ending. And I'll talk about how to find those in a minute, okay? So let's see if we're able to find pi, the middle point, by adding the start and the end and divide it by 2. So I'm going to do it. We have the start, which we said is 0, and the end, which we say is 2 pi. S representing start, E representing end, okay? So to find the middle, we would take 0 plus 2 pi, and I would get, what, 2 pi, right? And then if I divide it by 2, or you can think of it as multiplying it by 1/2, whichever is easier for you to remember, then I would get pi. So as you can see, my midpoint is 5. I mean, my midpoint's not 5. My midpoint is pi, and my midpoint here is also pi. So it does work. All right, let's test and see if we'll actually get the midpoint, the middle point between these two, the second, okay? So we take the second, and we'll take the first plus the middle. So the start, which is 0, plus the middle, which is m. So 0 plus pi is pi. And then we'll divide this by 2, or you say multiply by 1/2, and we get pi over 2. See? See how our second points match up? So then to get this fourth tick mark, to get the middle between these 2 points, I would add the middle and the end. Alright, so my middle was pi, my end was 2 pi, which is 3 pi. And if I multiply this by 1/2, or divide by 2, it would be 3 pi over 2. See? So it works. Now we have tested theory. Now the question is obviously, how do we find the start and the end? Because our graphs, as we know, have other letters here and other transformations that will change this beautiful, simple function, okay? So we're going to go ahead and find out how to do that. Alright, so looking at this, I know we have a lot of letters going on here. We have a 2, which is our amplitude, so that's a vertical stretch there. We have a vertical shift of 1, so that's our midline. We also have a horizontal shrink of 3, and then we have a horizontal shift of pi over 2, and it's shifting to the right. So the thing that we focus on for finding our 5 major points, the start, the end, the middle, the second, and the fourth point, is to just look at these values here, okay? So our main thing is to think about how the value here, the 3, and the value here, your B and your C, are affecting that start and end point. So if you go back to the graph for a minute, so that 3 is first making this graph shorter, okay? So if you ignore the points and just look at the graph, see, if it's going 3 times as fast, then it's probably going to be a lot faster, right? Obviously, I just did half as fast there, but whatever. So we have that shrinking there, and this is changing our start and our end point, right? Then we also have this shift going on right here. So this graph, as we said, will shift to the right. So maybe it's here like this. Okay? So it's hard to say what is going on, but those two values are changing those numbers on the x-axis for us, okay? So what we need to know is how do those values change from the 0? Because remember, our original graph started at 0. So how is that 3 and that pi over 2 changing that point? Well, the way to figure that out is to set those points equal to 0 and solve for the theta, or the x. Now, I think most students like to use x, so I'm going to use x instead. So to find the start point, we take the bx, I guess I'll put minus c, and we set it equal to 0. That's what we do. We always set it equal to 0, every single time. Okay, you're going to do that over and over and over again. So in this case, I would take the 3x minus the pi over 2 and set it equal to 0. And now I'm just solving the equation like you did for the warm-up. Alright, I like to get rid of the fractions, so I'm going to multiply everything by 2. So I get 6x minus 1 pi equals 0. Alright, so let's solve this. We would add pi to both sides. So we have 6x equals 1 pi. Divide by 6. So x equals pi over 6. So this means that with the horizontal shrink and the horizontal shift to the right, that my start point is no longer at 0. It's now at pi over 6. Okay? Alright, so to find my endpoint, we want to know how it's changing this endpoint that was originally at 2 pi, right? So all I would need to do to find my endpoint is to take the bx minus c and set it equal to 2 pi. Okay? So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take the 3x minus pi over 2 and set it equal to 2 pi. And I'm going to multiply this by 2 again to get rid of the fraction. So I get 6x minus pi equals 4 pi. Okay? Alright, so now we solve this algebraically. We add 1 pi to both sides. And we get 6x equals 5 pi. Divide by 6. So my endpoint is 5 pi over 6. Alright, so I told you guys we needed 5 points, right? Well, we just found the start point, which we said was pi over 6. And we found the end point, which was 5 pi over 6. Okay? So now we need to remember how to find this middle point. Do you guys remember what it was before? Alright, hopefully you said it was you add and divide by 2, or you add and multiply by 1/2, okay? So we're going to have to do some algebra here. Let me scroll this up, because we only need those 2 values. Alright, now I usually label things as M for middle, just to keep my work organized, okay? So we're going to take the start plus the end, and luckily they have common denominators, so it's easy to add. So we have 1 pi plus 5 pi, which is 6 pi over 6, which reduces to pi over 1. And then we've got to make sure we divide by 2 or multiply by 1/2, right? So I get pi over 2 as my midpoint. Okay? Alright, let's scroll over to our page. I'm going to add the pi over 2 here. And there we go, we got my midpoint. Alright, now this second point right here is the middle between these 2 points. So to find the second point, if you remember correctly, we will add these 2 and then divide by 2. Alright, so we're going to take my start plus my middle. Alright, and I'm going to have to find a common denominator here, right? So pi over 6. Let's see, we multiply the top and bottom by 3 here. Oops, that totally was not multiplied by 3. So we will get 3 pi over 6. So this will give us 4 pi over 6. Okay, which reduces to 2 pi over 3. Multiply by 1/2. So I get pi over 3. Okay. Yes, I know you get 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 3. I just simplified ahead of time by going 2 divided by 2. Okay? Alright. So now this point we know is pi over 3. See? Alright, last one. To find the middle between these 2 points, we do the same process. You add and divide by 2, add and divide by 2, over and over again. Alright, I call that the fourth point. So we take the middle, which was pi over 2. We add it to the end, which was 5 pi over 6. Now, we already found a common denominator for it right here, right? So I'm just going to rewrite that. 3 pi over 6 plus 5 pi over 6. So we get 8 pi over 6. I'm going to reduce that, which is 4 pi over 3. And multiply it by 1/2. So that becomes 2 pi over 3. Okay? Alright, So now we have our points, okay? So we have our start point, our second point, middle point, fourth point, and the end point, okay? Alright, so I know this is a lot, but this is showing your work, and if you are able to stay organized, it will be really easy to check your answers and stuff. And don't worry, I'm not giving you guys 20 problems to do. That's just crazy, okay? Alright, so let's look at this graph. I need to pull this down because I have it on 2 different screens. So we just took care of this part here. But we still have the 1 and the 2 to worry about. Now, do you guys remember how I told you to find your max and your min? Okay, hopefully you guys told me that you take your h and you add and subtract your a value, right? So in this case, it would be 1 plus or minus the 2. So my max is going to be at 3, and my min is going to be at -1. Okay? So let's take care of this one first, because that is our vertical shift. True? So I need a y-axis here so that I could label that. My y-axis is somewhere to the left. How do I know it's to the left? Because these are all positive values. So my y-axis has to be over here somewhere, right? Alright, now I'm going to put 1 right here. Okay? And I'm going to dash it just so I have a visual line for when I'm trying to graph this, okay? Alright, now I said that our max and our min was 2 above and 2 below, right? So I have to go up 2 from the midline, and I said it was at 3. I have to go down 2 for the min, which is at -1. Alright, let's check my list. I said that you guys needed to make sure you have graphed your 5 points on the x-axis, and that you needed your 3 points labeled on the y-axis, so your max, min, and your midline. Okay? So here's my max, min, and my midline. Okay? Now remember the shape. Remember the shape of the graph. It starts on the midline. So your graph is going to start right here because this is the starting point and this is the midline. Then it goes up to the max because that's the second point and that's the maximum value. It goes back to the midline. Then it goes to the min. Then it goes back to the midline. Okay, so if I was to trace this, my sine graph would look like that. See? So what's interesting about this is that if I was to go back to the first graph, alright, here's a screenshot from that first page, okay? So hopefully you guys notice that the shape is almost exactly the same here. In fact, if I enlarge this enough, you see this just about the same as that graph, right? So what you're going to find is that you guys are actually going to be making the same shape over and over and over again, okay? The only thing that's going to change is basically these numbers, they're scaling, and you're scaling down here, okay? Those are the only things that are going to change. Now, some things. See how when I drew my dot, it covered up my 3? That's okay. If that happens, make sure that you have your work shown over here so that I can check your values, okay? So just in case if I can't see it, I can go back and check your work, okay? Alright, so let's review real fast. So to find our start, this is something you definitely want to highlight and write down, by the way. You take your bx minus c and you set it equal to 0. To find your end, you take bx minus c and you set it equal to 2 pi. To find your midpoint, your middle point, you take the start plus the end and you divide it by 2. I like to say that you multiply it by 1/2. User's choice on that one. The second point is going to be your start plus your middle, and you divide it by 2 or multiply by 1/2. And then your fourth point is going to be your middle plus the end divided by 2 or multiply by 1/2. So this is like your cheat sheet. This is what you need to memorize and you need to know, okay? These are the things that I'm not going to give you on a quiz or a test. You're just going to have to kind of have knowledge of. Now, with your notes, you also probably want to write this down. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Might want to label start, middle, end, second, and fourth, just so you have a visual to go with your points here. I would also write down that your H plus or minus your A will give you your max and your min. And I would also write that your H is your midline. So these are all the things that you're going to need to be able to graph, okay? All right, we're going to do one more example, and then I'll let you guys kind of work on it yourselves. All right, so we're going to graph 3 sine of x over 3 plus 5 pi over 2, and then we're going to subtract 1 for the h, okay? So first I need to find my 5 points, my start, middle, end, second, and fourth, okay? So my start, if you remember correctly, we take this middle portion, this portion inside the parentheses, and I set it equal to 0. So I have x over 3 plus 5 pi over 2 equals 0. Now to get rid of the fractions here, I'm going to have to multiply it by a number that 3 and 2 both go in, the lowest common factor basically, and it's 6. Okay, that's because 6 divided by 3 is 2, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Okay, so this will be 2x plus, let's see, 6 divided by 2 is 3, 3 times 5 is 15 pi, equals 0. 6 times 0 is 0. Alright, so I minus 15 pi. So I get 2x equals negative 15 pi. Divide by 2. So x equals a negative 15 pi over 2. Okay? Alright, now I need to find my end. So we take the same thing and we set it equal to 2 pi. Okay? Alright, I have to multiply it by 6 again. That's the nice thing, is that once you do it for the start point, you don't have to really figure it out again for the end point, because it's usually the same thing. So I know it's going to be a 2x plus 15 pi, but now I need to make sure that I multiply the 6 and the 2, which is 12, right? So it's equal to 12 pi. Alright, so let's go ahead and solve it algebraically. So minus 15 pi. So I get 2x equals negative 3 pi. And then I got to divide by 2. So I get x equals a negative 3 pi over 2. Alright. I'm going to go ahead and plot my points here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my start point was negative 15 pi over 2. And my end point was negative 3 pi over 2. Alright, let's find my middle. For my middle, I only need those points there. So I have negative 15 pi over 2, because we take my start, add it to my end, negative 3 pi over 2. And I got negative 18 pi over 2. Okay, and negative 18 pi over 2 reduces to negative 9 pi. We multiply that by a half, or divide it by 2, user's choice of course. So I get a negative 9 pi over 2. To find my second, you do the start plus the middle and divide it by 2. So my start was 15 pi over 2 plus my middle, which is negative 9 pi over 2. We already have a common denominator on this one, so that's really, really good. Okay, so negative 15 plus a negative 9 is a negative 24 pi over 2, which is a negative 12 pi. Multiply it by 1/2, or you can divide it by 2, your choice. It's a negative 12. I like to multiply it by 1/2. So I get, oh, well, negative 6 pi. Okay. I'll come back to that actually. My fourth point is the middle plus the end. So my middle is negative 9 pi over 2 plus my end, which is negative 3 pi over 2. So negative 9 plus negative 3 is negative 12, which is negative 6. Multiply it by 1/2. And I get negative 6. Oh, I just get negative 3 pi. Okay? Alright, so let's go ahead and transfer these green ones there. Make sure I multiplied by 1/2 on each one. I did, so we're good. So this was a negative 9 pi over 2. Then we had negative 6 pi, negative 3 pi. Now I have a lot of students at this point that go, Ms. Sykes, how do I know if I made a mistake or not? Like, is there a way for me to visually tell if I messed up on something, okay? And the answer is yes. So the way to do it really fast is to make sure that all of these have a common denominator first. Okay, these two don't have a common denominator, so let me just rewrite it so that it does have a common denominator. How do you do that? You put it over 1, right? And we want a common denominator of 2, so you multiply the top and bottom by 2, okay? And then you look for a pattern. So notice it goes from negative 15 to negative 12, negative 9, negative 6, negative 3. See how you're adding 3 each time? So since every value has a consistent pattern, this is probably correct. Most of the time if you make a mistake somewhere, you'll know, like if you forgot to multiply by 1/2, because the pattern won't be consistent, okay? Now in case you were wondering, on this one here, you can check it, make all them have a common denominator of 6, and you'll see that there's a pattern there as well. Alright, let's finish this up. My y-axis is over here somewhere because I have negative values, so obviously it goes over here. My midline is at a negative 1. There's my negative 1 midline that I drew in. It's hard to see that's a negative. And my amplitude is 3. So I need to stretch up 3. So here's 1, 2, 3, and down 3. 1, 2, 3. Ran out of room just a little bit. Alright, so my minimum is at negative 4. And my maximum is at 2. Alright, and then we plot my points. So I start on the midline, go up to the maximum, back to the midline, to the minimum, and back to the midline. So when I trace my graph, it looks like this. There you go. Okay, so I did 2 examples for you. One I kind of made messier in the math, and the other ones I made pretty straightforward. So go ahead and get the worksheet from the sub. You will have 10 problems to do. Please do your work on another sheet of paper and put your graphs on the worksheet. So that way we can clearly see all the points, and then if you made a mistake, we can go back and look at your work, okay? All right, good luck, you guys.